Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's broadcast. And we want to go ahead and focus on the French Revolution. Now, we are getting ready for midterms coming up, which a lot of you know what? Let me go ahead. We've got 10 of you in here right now. All right. So what I'm going to ask here, when is your midterm exam scheduled? Now, I call it a midterm. Some people call it, semester final. So that's fine too. I'll make sure to make that clear. And let's say before Christmas or after Christmas. Now, I find typically that about 70%, from what I've seen in the past, about 70% of students tend to take these before Christmas. So we're going to be focusing after next week. We'll get into some things from there. All right. And so looks like everybody has answered the poll. Now I've got 12 people in here. 3 people have answered the poll. So if anybody can come in and answer the poll, that would be great. All right. So go ahead and do that just so we have that information. Okay, so it looks like most of you here before Christmas. So next week, I'm going to be focusing on Napoleon. And then, of course, we'll take questions about other things as well. And then we'll focus on reviewing for midterms the next 2 weeks. And so what we'll do is have a pre-1648, have a pre-1648 like Renaissance, Reformation, a little bit absolutism, and then we'll have a post 1648. Now, of course, if the questions come from different directions, that's fine as well. Okay, so as far as that goes, we will, the so-called period 1, which is 1450 to 1648, and then the so-called period 2, which is 1648 to 1815. Okay, so next week, Napoleon will be the declared area of emphasis, even though it looks like based on some of the questions, we'll be getting to that tonight as well. Remember, go ahead and put questions in there. Much appreciation to Emily for the way that she gets these things going. It is just always very nice to see questions waiting for me when I get there. Okay, so awesome. All right, so going from there, we can go ahead and take a look there. So let's go ahead, and Emily, you're also welcome to contact me. I believe we follow each other on Instagram, so that's another way to get in touch as well, to discuss some future topics. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with this question. I've got 7 questions from Emily, and we've got some others, hopefully, that y'all will ask. So to what extent was the French Revolution socialist? Okay, now, that's really, when we look at the phases of the French Revolution, it's just a big mess. Now, one thing that I did in my class the other day, Emily, and I kind of burned a class period for this, but my students really enjoyed the exercise, is that I got my students to write down, like in one column, like to do a 2-column setup on their paper, and in one column to write down, like, what are things that they envision as being American, and in the other column, what are some things that are un-American. And so, there are things like, football and apple pie, and, just that you can do a big list, okay, of, freedom, some things that we think of as being American. And then, of course, like un-American, communism, soccer, all of that kind of stuff, So the thing is that, we had this very lengthy discussion about the way that even today, if we think about what does it mean to be an American or have American values, that there's certainly like disagreement about that, and people would rank those values differently. And so when we look at the French Revolution, when we think about the values of the French Revolution, I've talked about Rousseau before as a proto-socialist. I would say that when you look at what Rousseau has put together philosophically, and what Jacques-Louis was advocating, and, other folks, that there certainly is this idea of the individual being less important than the group. Now, of course, when we look at the 1789 revolution, we see a great deal of liberalism. And so so, liberalism being focused on the individual and a free market economy. And we see a lot of those reforms happening in the very beginning, but then we start to see the revolution like radicalizing. And so one of the sections of my French Revolution series is focusing on the civil constitution of the clergy. And so the civil constitution of the clergy, rather than like when you look at the August 4th decrees, basically nobility and the privileges of nobility, we're getting rid of them. And so that was a liberal reform. If we look at the August 4th decrees, completely liberal. Now, then again, when you look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, there certainly are things about individual rights, but then we get into the nation, okay? And so there's one thing about the French Revolution is this emphasis. Now, there's liberalism, where we're thinking about individual rights, representative government, all of that. And then there is this like nationalism that is, and the thing about nationalism is it's not, there's nothing wrong with it per se, kind of like, one of my students talks about toxic masculinity, as she calls it. And, one of the things is there's certainly nothing wrong with masculinity or someone being masculine, but there may be ways that can go overboard, which is kind of similar with nationalism, because when you get into like a really national, radical nationalistic construct where the individual is not as important as the group, and you start to see not only as nationalism uniting people as part of a community, but also looking, what do you have there, Matt? Yeah, go ahead and out with it. Okay, so yeah, go ahead and let me know what you got there. All right. And so, nationalism in some cases, I mean, it's certainly very useful for the French Revolutionary Wars, where they're having to send these large bodies of like patriotic, excited soldiers against these smaller, more disciplined Austrian and Prussian armies and, the coalition forces. And so nationalism is great for that. But of course, what we see during the Reign of Terror is this nationalism that pits like one part of the country versus another. Like when you look at the program of de-Christianization, and you look at these peasants in the Vendée that are resisting, this because, they were loyal, they were faithful to the king, they were faithful to the church. And, these people, though, they've got to be gotten rid of because they're different. And so when we look at, I typically, when I'm talking about the 19th century, liberalism is about the individual, socialism is about the group. It's something that, I think during the terror, when you've got, for example, the ban on white bread. Okay, so when the idea is that white bread is less efficient to make than brown bread, it's wasteful. You got to get rid of stuff to make it. So when the National Convention basically bans white bread and says that everybody's going to eat brown bread because that way there's more bread to go around, then that is an illiberal economic measure. That is certainly socialist in the sense that if the baker decides, hey, I want to bake some white bread and I want to sell it to rich people, that is illegal. And so, I would say that during the Reign of Terror, we certainly see a fair amount of socialism, but really more of a proto-socialism that's mixed with a really especially toxic form of nationalism that is pitting French people against one another and not just uniting the French people against, outsiders, outside enemies. Robespierre is very clear that the enemies of the people are not just outside the nation, or outside the country, but within, that there are people who are dangerous. And so, the economic measures that were passed during the Reign of Terror, certainly. But I don't think that I would say that like the French Revolution outside of the terror was necessarily socialist, but certainly very nationalistic. And so when you look at Napoleon, for example, like Napoleon is certainly not a not a liberal figure. He's not somebody who's promoting liberalism, but he is someone who is promoting the goal of nationalism. I think that there's certainly this idea of the nation that is always there, even from the 1789 revolution, that we see like this, this liberal movement, a nationalist movement, all of these things kind of coming together. So hopefully I've answered that just a little bit. But the Reign of Terror definitely has some kind of precursors to socialism, including, now I've got, this is from one of the, Mr. Goots class at whatever high school, that Kellum High School in Virginia Beach, No Time for Stalin. Let's see, we're aiming for high marks. I get it. All right. So as far as that goes, so good question to start off with. But yeah, it's just when it comes down to it, I mean, the French Revolution's a mess, and it's it's certainly the most difficult part of the course for students to really wrap their brains on. So as far as the reaction of neighboring countries to the French Revolution, of course, this reaction was largely negative. And so while the students may not need to know like all of the, the vocabulary, like the Declaration of Pillnitz and the Brunswick Manifesto and that sort of thing, it is important for students not only for this period, but also looking at the Congress of Vienna, knowing that the conservative forces in other countries, they saw the French Revolution and they were immediately threatened by it, because they realized that, like, if this sweeps over France, if France has a republic, then everything, that could happen anywhere. Okay. So if the French monarchy can be toppled, then all of these other aristocratic monarchies can be toppled as well. So certainly, from the very beginning, when it looked like Louis XVI was threatened, Austria and Prussia start to mobilize against the French Revolution, and of course later on are joined by Britain and other allies. So I would say the main thing is just to know that the responses of other European governments, excuse me, I'm like hiccuping like crazy. The responses of other European governments were overwhelmingly negative, and of course there was a military response to the French Revolution as well. So from 1792, goodness, 1792 to Napoleon's consulate, you see that there is this constant warfare. And I think it's important for people to note kind of the backdrop there, because the other thing is, when you look at what's going on with the National Convention and the Reign of Terror and all of that kind of stuff, that was the whole thing was about war. That the September massacres were really the first instance of violence against French people that was sanctioned by the government. That you've got the Prussian and the Austrian armies that are coming in, and well, if they get to Paris, they're going to let out the prisoners, and the prisoners are going to join them and work against the revolution. Well, what do we need to do? We need to kill the prisoners. And so that, I think, is important, even if some of the details are not. But going forward to the Congress of Vienna, and seeing what happens there in the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, certainly it's helpful for students to understand that the reactions of the other European governments were definitely quite hostile. And so let's see what we've got. We've got another couple things here. The changes in the four phase. Okay, okay, very good, Lauren. I can definitely help you out with that. I see we've got some questions about Napoleon, the Restoration, all of that kind of stuff, and definitely we'll get to that. All right. And of course, I'll be open to talking about Napoleon next time as well. That'll be our titled topic next time. Okay, so let me just find the presentation, because I want to make sure to put this in front of y'all. All right, so French Revolution, Napoleon. I think this is where I get to the radicalization. Okay. All right, so as far as that goes, let me go ahead and open up the radicalization of the French Revolution. All right. And of course, I've got this on a YouTube video, but I'm going to go ahead and just kind of focus on, in particular, answering the question that we've got here. So let me screen there, and whoa, what? I swear I saw something about the different phases of the French Revolution. Oh, yes. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and start answering Lauren's question. Okay. So we've got that. We're answering a question. And So as far as that goes, this process of radicalization, which is going kind of build a bridge from the 1789, 1790 revolution, which was focused on liberalism and nationalism, to this more radical revolution. So when we look at the four phases of the French Revolution, we've got the liberal phase, the radical phase, the directory phase, and the Napoleonic phase. And you can see that really these phases are only lasting a few years each, but they are by far, I would say, the most significant. Now, of course, Napoleon was significant as well, but as far as defining the revolution, this is what we're looking at there. Now, of course, the radical phase is called this because it was really the only time where the kind of radicalism we see during the Reign of Terror was triumphant. Other than that, really cooler heads are ruling the day. So although we see, we remember the most dramatic part of the French Revolution, but it really was quite short-lived. Now, from 1791 to 1793, we're really going from like, here is Locke, like John Locke, government exists to promote life, liberty, property, and that there should be some type of popular element or representation in the government because the social contract comes from the people. But Locke's social contract is very individualistic, whereas, Rousseau's social contract is, I'd say sometimes he puts the social back in social contract, that it's really about the nation rather than the welfare of the individuals in the nation. So if individuals need to be sacrificed for the nation, then that is Rousseau, whereas we don't see that in John Locke's social contract. Now, I was talking about this earlier. I mentioned Jacques-Louis David earlier, so let me actually chat with you a bit about this, because this is Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii, which is neoclassical painting, and this is from 1786. It's actually even before the French Revolution even starts, but it goes back to an old Roman story. It was kind of like a Roman David and Goliath from the early Roman Republic when Rome was just a city. Instead of 1-on-1, they said, we will, let's have a 3-on-3. And so what you see here is this idea, and really Jacques-Louis David is already into the idea of republicanism before it becomes cool. And he's already promoting this idea of classical republicanism and the ideas of Rousseau. So these brothers Horatii volunteered themselves to be the three Roman champions, and they are putting their lives on the line for their city, all right, for their country, for their people. And so they are here submitting to the general will. That's really the thing about Rousseau's social contract, is submitting to the general will. Now, then we also see Rousseau's focus on separate spheres, because while these men are stepping up and they're doing the manly thing of being in the public sphere and sacrificing themselves for the nation, the women are here crying, desolate, protecting the children. Okay, they're just there, so their wives are there just beside themselves, and then you see this one woman who's protecting these two children. So women are supposed to be, according to Rousseau, in the in the private sphere, in the domestic sphere, whereas men are supposed to be out there sacrificing themselves for the community. Are they Nazis, Walter? One thing to always note is when you see some of David's work, you see these salutes that look fascist. Well, these are Roman salutes. And so when Mussolini, fascism is based on the Roman fasces, which was a bundle of sticks that was a symbol of authority in the Roman Republic. And so fascism is built on this premise that it is about the whole, okay, that the people are basically all sticks in the bundle, and that is what creates the state. And so that's why I'll refer to, I refer to some of these folks as kind of proto-socialist, because it's not something that's full on socialism, but it certainly has those elements that the individual needs to be sacrificed for the group, that there are times when that happens, whether it's a patriotic sacrifice or whether it's getting rid of people who don't submit to the general will. And of course, with the death of Socrates, that's another one where Socrates was unjustly punished, that he was told that you're going to have to drink hemlock. You've been found guilty by your political community of being a free thinker. And what we see here is Crito, one of Socrates' wealthy friends, got into prison and said, I'm going to break you out of here. And Socrates is saying, no, I'm not going to break out of here, that I am a citizen of Athens and I would rather die an Athenian, even if it's unjustly, than live somewhere else. So Socrates is yet another example of this patriotic, nationalistic self-sacrifice, that it's more important to lay down your own life for the political community than to preserve it. And so as far as that goes, we go into the phases of the French Revolution. Okay, now the first phase is the liberal phase. Now, as we define liberal, remember that in the United States, like the word liberal is almost like it's become like a hot potato. It's like nobody really knows if you say, like, what does that mean? The word progressive, I think, has a better meaning. And liberalism is really, it's something that has changed so much in the United States that it really, I don't think it really has a lot of meaning anymore. Now, what we need to define as liberal is, there are some nuances, but very similar to someone who is a libertarian. Basically, this idea of a more limited government that is focusing on the individual and getting rid of, social distinctions, legally protected social distinctions, at least. So the dominant class here being the bourgeoisie, the goal being a constitutional monarchy, that there were several people from the Third Estate and even from the First and Second Estates that really wanted to see something. They didn't want to get rid of the monarchy, but they wanted to reform it. They wanted to create a constitutional monarchy that would work a lot like the British monarchy. And they wanted to abolish legal privileges. So the legal privileges of the church and the nobility. And so now remember, with the civil constitution of the clergy, if the French, had wanted to, the French government had decided, to do it as a liberal measure, like the decrees of August 4th, which abolished noble privileges, it was just like, okay, you no longer have any special protections of the government from the government because you're a member of this group. Now, instead, what the civil constitution of the clergy did, instead of reforming things on a liberal basis, they reformed things on a more like nationalistic, maybe a bit of social sort of basis, because they made the church an organ of the state, like a subordinate organ of the state. But at least at first, it's like, we want to get rid of these privileges. Now, the influencers here would be John Locke and Montesquieu when we're looking at this liberal phase. And the governing bodies would be the National Assembly, and what followed them was the Legislative Assembly. Now, I don't think that you would have to know the difference between the National Assembly and the Legislative Assembly to do well on the AP Euro exam. All right. So that's the liberal phase. And I would say that goes through about 1791. And then we see the radical phase. Now, what you see here, the Jacobins. Now, the Jacobins, a lot of them actually come from the bourgeoisie, but the Jacobins were Republicans. Okay. Now, not Republicans like we have in the United States, but Republicans like nearly everybody is in the United States. Not like a political party, but to be a Republican is to believe in a Republican form of government. So when we look here, constitutional monarchy. Okay, that is not what you're seeing in the radical phase. The Jacobins, these people who are Republicans, they are wanting to bring down the monarchy, and they're assisted by the sans-culottes, okay, or the sans-culottes, or however you would say it in French, but it's a written test. And so the sans-culottes, while the bourgeoisie are, they're your white collar workers, your professionals, people who, like today, your six-figure types. And then, or, somebody may, they make a very comfortable salary working a job that doesn't really require them to sweat. Sans-culottes, these are people who are shopkeepers, artisans, people who are really the urban working class, the people who actually work for a living and work with their hands and not with their minds, like somebody like Robespierre, who was an attorney. And so the goals here, you start to see like egalitarianism, like not just the abolition of legal privilege, but that we will enforce equality, a nationalistic movement, republicanism, and also cheap bread, which is why some of these measures are passed during the Reign of Terror that regulates the production of bread that was kind of illiberal. Now, the biggest influencer here during the radical phase, the philosophical foundation, would be Rousseau, and specifically Rousseau's idea of the general will. And the governing bodies here, and you should probably know both of these, the National Convention being the legislative body, and the Committee on Public Safety being the, really the executive organ. Like this is the smaller group of people that had a great deal of power. So that's the radical phase there. Now, then you go to the directory, and I'm going to take just a very quick break to blow my nose, and I will be right back, I promise. So just give me a quick moment here, and let me go ahead and stop sharing that. And yes, I will be right back. All right, and I'm back. All right, now the directory, I haven't really made like formal slides for this, but as far as the directory, I refer to this as kind of a cooling off period of the revolution. This is really the period that you would need to know as a student the least about. Like, I mean, the directory is kind of one of those things. Okay, then they've got an executive committee that takes over for a little bit. The reign of terror is over after the Thermidorian reaction, so we don't see like the mass like guillotining and all of that kind of stuff. But the directory is really never completely stable, okay? Because what happens is once the reign of terror is over, it's not like the Jacobins go away. I mean, you've still got some Jacobins who are, very active, but at the same time, during the reign of terror, all the monarchists kind of kept quiet. But at this time, after that, you've got Jacobins, you've got sans-culottes, you've got monarchists, who are all basically vying for power during this time. So the directory, although they did have some military successes, and of course, Napoleon was a very successful general during this time, it was still a period of kind of they're really like they're keeping the Republican calendar, but they're not forcing people to do it. A lot of what you see, especially in the countryside, is that now that people aren't being guillotined anymore for having Catholic masses and stuff like that, the churches have been turned into Republican temples, to the supreme being, and so you start to see during the time of the Directory that the churches are starting to be restored to Christian worship and that sort of thing. Now, the Napoleonic phase is really one of those things as far as, that it's a dictatorship. Okay, but it is really not, it's not like we see here dictator, we think like Stalin, Hitler, that sort of thing. That some people, I've seen that the Napoleonic phase called the age of Voltaire, okay, because really Napoleon is kind of like the consummate enlightened absolutist, and we can talk about some of his reforms, so I'm answering another question. But really Napoleon's, time is basically, he is uniting the nation. So we see, that really, maybe Napoleon is not the most liberal figure in the world. Okay, Napoleon is controlling the press and he's controlling some other things, but at the same time, he was supported by the French people. Like, he was very popular. Napoleon would occasionally have plebiscites where people got to vote for him. He's like, he wants to be elected. Do you approve of my performance as emperor? And so the people loved Napoleon. And so as far as that goes, but Napoleon's also turning France into a nation. Like Louis the 14th, would have like he tried. Like Louis the 14th wanted to make one set of laws in France. Napoleon did this. He made the Napoleonic Code, which created a single set of laws for all of France based on Roman law. Now, just like I was showing you some of Jacques-Louis David's neoclassical paintings. So Napoleon is still, even though he's proclaiming France to be an empire, he still is motivated by, he's motivated by the Romans. They're still looking to them, whether it's the Republic or an empire, that they are motivated by this Roman example that you see there. So Napoleon's greatest civil reforms, okay, so one of those being the Napoleonic Code, of course, which created one law for all of France. Like before the French Revolution, there were still a lot of local laws that there really wasn't a national legal system per se. They had all these like Parlement, which were, these judicial bodies that were regional in scope. So there was never really a national law at that time. Now, also Napoleon was responsible for the Concordat of the Concordat of 1801, okay? And that is where Napoleon made a formal agreement with the Catholic Church to restore the Catholic Church to France. Now, it's one of those things, it's kind of like a pendulum, okay, that before the French Revolution, the Catholic Church was the state religion of France. It had official sanction. And then you see that you got the civil constitution of the clergy, and then finally de-Christianization, okay? And then Napoleon kind of brings it maybe there. Okay, not all the way here, but just kind of like what he proclaimed Catholicism to be was not a state religion, but the majority religion. Okay, and that religion would be visible. So when you see like Jacques-Louis David's the coronation of where you see the crowning of Josephine. Let's see where we are there. In the coronation of Napoleon. So when we look here, let me go ahead and show this off for you. See here that Napoleon is surrounded by Catholic clergy, that you see that there are some bishops there. So Napoleon wants the Catholic Church there in its ceremonial function, but it doesn't have all of the privileges that it had previously, okay? So it's the majority religion in the sense kind of that Christianity is the majority religion of America. It's like, the overwhelming majority of Americans identify as Christians. The overwhelming majority of French people at that time identified as Catholic, which even today, I think you would have, a bit of a majority that at least would be nominally Catholic. So now the thing is, they're president official functions, stuff like that, but they don't have the kind of say that they had, and also religious toleration. So people, according to the dictates of enlightened absolutism, Napoleon is allowing the French people to practice personally whatever religion they want, but at functions of state, the Catholic Church is visible. Now, another thing, and Louis XIV would have loved to have this, is that Napoleon got the Catholic Church to agree to give him the power of investiture, which meant that Napoleon got to choose who the bishops were. And so that's something that, was definitely something that's different there. So the Concordat was one of Napoleon's reforms. Now, I'm getting toward the end of Emily's initial questions. Emily's kind of, later on, you'll probably address Keynesian economics if you haven't already in U.S. history with the New Deal. But Emily comes in here at the very beginning and she primes the pump. She gets it going, okay? She gets the discussion going. And the whole idea of priming the pump is that then the private sector comes in and the economy will get back on its feet, and then the government authority can step back from the deficit spending. So anybody that's got a question or anything like that, Emily's done a great job priming the pump and getting us started, but I probably don't have 25 minutes of questions remaining. Yeah, that was right off the top of my head, Emily. So glad you like that. So as far as that goes, just remember that. So the Concordat, and another one would be that Napoleon does roll back some of the gains that women had seen during the Reign of Terror. Now, during the Reign of Terror, a lot of people's heads were being cut off, but women were given some, rights such as an equal right to sue for divorce. That before the French Revolution, it was easier for a man to divorce his wife than it was for a woman to divorce divorce her husband. It was almost unheard of for a woman to sue for divorce. Now, also, there was no such thing as like child support or anything like that. So, women rarely would have done something like, you wouldn't have seen like child support, alimony, and stuff like that. I mean, if a woman left her husband, she'd be out on her own. And she didn't have access to education or the professions or anything like that. So Napoleon, in some ways you could compare him to Augustus Caesar, that, Napoleon was concerned, like when you look at the whole idea of republicanism, that sort of thing, there has to be some kind of virtue there. And Napoleon felt like that the excesses of the radical revolution had undermined the family. And so he made it more difficult to get a divorce, especially for a woman. That the only way that a woman could sue for divorce under the Napoleonic Code was if the husband had brought his mistress into the house. And because if the husband brings his mistress into the house, then he has acted with contempt toward her and has embarrassed her. And so that's why Napoleon's saying, like, yeah, if a husband's like being that flagrant, then yes. But simple like adultery, like, oh, my husband's got a girlfriend, it's like, big deal, doesn't everybody? Boys will be boys, sort of thing. So as far as that goes, those would be the top three that I would say. You've got the Napoleonic Code, and then you've got the Concordat of 1801. And then, of course, the clamping down on family laws, divorce laws, that sort of thing. All right. And Napoleon's war in Spain. Okay. Now, this is something like the military history of Napoleon's not going to be something we're going to see that is, figuring very much into the exam. But one thing that from a military history perspective that's kind of interesting, and you see this again in Russia, is that Napoleon was very good at conventional warfare. So get two armies on the battlefield. Napoleon's army was amazing. So Napoleon, was able to conquer Spain, but then you start to see now during the war in the Vendée, where this civil war that happened in this region of France known as the Vendée, where you had this peasant uprising and basically a noble-led peasant army. They called this, like, after the Catholic and Royal Army was defeated on the battlefield, the leaders of the war in the Vendée retreated to the woods and the marshes and all of that, and they launched what was called then La Petite Guerre. Which is little war. Now, of course, when we translate this into Spanish, guerrilla or guerrilla warfare. And so this is what Napoleon's troops encountered in Spain. And so when we look at Goya's painting, and I always, let's see, the 3rd of May, I always forget like exactly what day in May was that. That's always problematic for me. But the 3rd of May. So what we see here, let me go ahead and pull up Goya's painting here. Okay, so when you look over here, this is an execution during this time. Now, of course, Goya was Spanish, and what would happen here is these guerrilla soldiers would be captured and then executed. So you see Napoleon's regulars that are executing these guerrillas, and so guerrilla warfare was something where Napoleon and his men were not nearly as as good at unconventional warfare. And so we see the same thing in Russia when Napoleon goes into Russia, and the Russians opt for, they essentially allow Napoleon to move in. Okay, so conventional warfare would be the Russian army meets Napoleon at the border, like, we will not let you cross into our country. But what the Russians did was, we will pull back until you're right about to enter Moscow. Now, the thing is that the Russians could not justify allowing Napoleon into their capital without a fight. Honor dictates that you offer a battle before he goes in the capital. But the Russian army, they knew that they couldn't win that conventional battle, so they gave it a good college try. I mean, they gave him a good battle, and then they retreated. It wasn't like a rout or anything like that. When they'd had enough, they retreated in an orderly fashion off the battlefield, and there is Moscow, which was open to Napoleon. And then Moscow catches on fire. Then it's winter, and this big grand army that Napoleon brought into Russia 80% of them are dead by the time they cross back, maybe more than that. At least 80% are dead by the time they cross back out of Russia. Because as Napoleon is making his way back, as he's retreating, he's being harassed by the Russians when he sends out foraging parties. They're being, they're being attacked. And so the Russians put a very unconventional approach into resisting Napoleon, which he was unable to meet. So that's the thing. Give Napoleon conventional warfare, he's good, until he's not, when you go to the Battle of the Nations and the Battle of Waterloo later on. But by and large, I mean, put him on a conventional battlefield, excellent. But unconventional warfare, Spain and Russia, not so much. I would, as far as this goes, this question about the extent of Napoleon's empire, how did he distribute power among his family members? If I remember right, he made his brother king of Rome. But this is something that's not going to be necessarily a big deal. Now, I would say here, let me go into this, because there are some relevant things that that we could get into there. Okay, so let's go ahead and just take a look at this map here concerning the, whoa, that's a little bitty thing there. I'm about to share my screen as soon as I've got this up. Okay, so this is coming up. Let me go ahead and share. And here we go. All right, so the first French Empire here, let's see what we can do there. All right, so when we look here, we see that there is France, and then there are these conquered / allied areas. Now notice that Napoleon directly annexed some places, but others he basically turned into dependent territories. So Spain was not Spain wasn't necessarily part of the first French Empire, but they were affiliated with it. Okay, so when we look here, let's see. Okay, they're not going into the individual directly administered or client states. Okay, so you see here where Napoleon directly when you go into the Netherlands, okay, and then part of Germany here, but you've got the Netherlands, part of modern Germany. You see here going into the Balkans and Austria, where that is being directly administered. We see some areas in Italy, like Milan and Tuscany, that are going into Rome, that are directly administered. It looks like he conquered a bit of Spain here, and then you've got these allied states, and of course even Russia and Austria signed a peace with Napoleon, and so Napoleon tried to dominate the continent, and what that resulted in was the Continental System. Now, of course, Napoleon, since he was defeated once by Admiral Lord Nelson at the Battle of the Nile and another time at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon was unable to launch a land invasion of Britain. And because of that, he had to rely on what was called the Continental System. And the Continental System was this system where everybody on the continent trades together, which is kind of funny when you think about maybe this prefiguring Brexit. One of those things when we think about Brexit, it's like, is Britain European or is Britain not European? And that's really one of those things. It's like Britain is right there next to Europe, and certainly kind of Europe, but not really. I mean, I was looking, my wife was actually cleaning out one of our closets, and she got out some, I saw on the dresser, there were some UK plugs, okay? As far as, when you're plugging in your stuff, a plug adapter. And so, you've got a way, we've got our plug, our outlets in the United States, continental Europe. You go through all out the European Union, and you've got the same kind of outlet. Now, when you go to the UK, it's a different kind of outlet. They've got their own thing going, and that's just how they are. They're a little bit different. But Napoleon, tried to isolate the British by not trading with them, basically an embargo. Which the British they responded with a naval blockade of Europe. Now, this is the context of the War of 1812, that basically the United States is not able to trade with the European continent because of the British blockade. Well, what happens? Napoleon invades Russia because Russia decided that they were going to start trading with Britain. Britain needed some lumber, and Russia's like, here you go. And Napoleon says, I know you didn't. I mean, he just sends that grand army over there. So the Continental System would be an important thing to note, that this is Napoleon's attempt to isolate the British economically. But that's kind of an interesting thing in European history, where we divide it between Europe's attempts to isolate Britain and Britain's attempts to isolate itself. And now you've got this whole, this whole thing going on in Europe right now with Brexit. All right. Nora, that is a great question. I think that what I've already said about the Continental System in response to Emily's question would be about all you would need to know here. Okay, so as far as that goes, the Continental System, the purpose was to isolate Britain economically. And then, so the purpose was to isolate Britain economically. And of course, the cause of Napoleon's invasion of Russia was Russia backing out of the Continental System. But other than that, I wouldn't see why you would need to have any more in-depth knowledge. I certainly don't have any, although I hope to. Like I said, I need to read I bought this book here, and I do intend to read it at some point. I mean, but I've still got a little bit of work to do on my French Revolution series before I get to that. And it's okay not to know everything. That's why, I love like the way that Emily asks a lot of these questions, because they're like, a lot of them are very specific, and a lot of them are actually kind of going beyond the bounds of the exam. And sometimes, it's like, as somebody who has, I've taught this course for a decade now, but my first few years of this, there was a lot of stuff like within bounds that I didn't even know. And, I could have taken the exam my first year and made a 5 on it. But, at the same time, there's still a lot of stuff that a person that makes a 5 still doesn't even know. But it is a learning process. But sometimes if you're a student, you've got like one class here, 1 year to learn this. And you don't want to get too caught up in the minutia, because you want to make sure that you're learning all of the things that are inbounds. All right. So as far as that goes, we've got that one. All right. So why was the National Convention? Nora, you might have to be a little bit more specific with that. Okay. Now remember that the National Convention was an elected body. Okay. So now if you look at my lecture on the Reign of Terror, I go into like Robespierre was the leader of, a faction of Jacobins, the Mountain. Now, of course, there was that other faction, the Girondins, who were taken out very early. You had the conflict between the Girondins and the, and the the Girondins and the Mountain. And of course, the Mountain, which is another Jacobin faction there. Robespierre is the leader of this faction. And then Robespierre, then you've got these other factions, that the Hébertists, okay? So this guy Hébert and his people, they thought Robespierre wasn't radical enough. And so Robespierre was like, whoa, like, I thought I was crazy. Y'all are really crazy. You're going to the guillotine. And so they went to the guillotine. Then you had the Dantonists, the followers of George Danton. And those people were too moderate. Like, basically, Danton had the nerve to ask, like, hey, this terror, and it was a terror. It's not like the Reign of Terror is something that we retroactively apply. Like, this is something that Robespierre actually used this term. Like, the terror was a thing, and Robespierre saw this as necessary. And so the thing is, the terror is like a necessary evil. And Danton said, when is this going to stop? Okay, that when are we actually, like, the terror was supposed to be a temporary measure and it's still going on, that can we talk about when we're going to stop this? And it's like, dude, you are outside of the nation and you are not submitting to the general will. And the only person that would ask, like, when's the terror going to stop is somebody who is an enemy of the people. Guillotine. All right. So as far as that goes, that even in Robespierre's group, there are sub-factions. And this happens anytime you have a concentration of power, that you're going to have groups within a faction. Like in the U.S. History Review, I was talking about how, even in parties, that there were, in U.S. history during Reconstruction, there was the there were the Lincoln Republicans, and then there were the Radical Republicans, and they didn't like Lincoln or his Reconstruction policy, and there was clashing there. We see today there are Republicans who don't like President Trump. President Trump represents a faction of the Republican Party. There are some Republicans who aren't too crazy about him. Like the Republican Party, as we know it today, if we had a multi-party system, the Republican Party could easily be divided into four groups. Okay, that you could have like the moderates, who would probably like combine with some people who are, independent and Democrats, like a moderate, kind of your Jeb Bush wing of the party. Then you would have like your social conservative, like, religious group that like you to think about like Ted Cruz and Ben Carson. Then you would have like your kind of textbook conservatives. Then you would have your libertarians that vote Republican. And then you would have like, President Trump represents a faction of the Republican Party that is more, nationalistic, anti-immigration, pro-tariff. So in a multi-party system, we would have like, probably 10 plus parties. Like in the Netherlands, there are, I think, over 15 parties that are represented in their parliament. And so the thing is, what we have to understand is, even though somebody may be in our politics, a Democrat or a Republican, then it doesn't, I mean, they're part of a faction, but there are sub-factions. Same thing here in the National Convention, that although the Jacobins were dominant, there are certainly other people out there and also factions within the Jacobin movement. What is it necessary to understand about the Bourbon Restoration? Okay, I think that it's important to understand that the Bourbons were restored to power. Okay, that's something that's important, that this was done by the Congress of Vienna. I would say that I wouldn't necessarily you don't have to go very deep into it. I think this really all goes into the Congress of Vienna, really, that France was restored to its 1791 borders. Like in my lecture on the Congress of Vienna, I think that everything's there that needs to be known about the restoration, that basically this concert of Europe and all of that stuff that's going on, with that. And so the internal politics of the Bourbon Restoration, not so much, not nearly as big of a deal as some of the other stuff. So I would say that really just within the context of the Congress of Vienna, and knowing that Napoleon was followed by a restored Bourbon monarchy, and also that I'm pretty, it's getting to be the end of the evening, but I don't think the Bourbon Restoration, it's not necessarily like an absolute monarchy the same way that you had beforehand, but it's not really, you wouldn't really get into the internal aspects of the Bourbon Restoration on the AP Euro exam, much more on the external, dealing with the Congress of Vienna. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, it is 9:52, and it looks like we may be out of questions. Now, even though Napoleon is going to be the set topic for next week, we can certainly take some other questions, some general questions about the French Revolution and that sort of thing, because we did a lot of stuff talking about Napoleon tonight. We may have a different group next week who wants to talk about some different things. So what we have planned is that we've got Napoleon next week, and then I'm going to focus the next week on review for the so-called period one, 1450 to 1648, Renaissance, Reformation, and the like. All right, anybody got any quick questions before I go? I mean, technically we've got 7 minutes, so I mean, I'm here. But I'm not just going to sit here for 7 minutes and stare at you. Now, there should be something here. There should be a button below the screen where you see me, where it says replays and future live sessions. Remember, people who are subscribed to Fiveable get access to replays. If you're not subscribed to Fiveable, I'm pretty sure you're just getting like these live sessions and that's it. So just be sure to click on that if you see something there. Do y'all see something on your screen like mine here? There's a button here that says replays and future live sessions, and it has a link to some more information about Fiveable. Now, if you're a student whose teacher has signed you up for Fiveable, you're good. You're getting all Fiveable stuff. If you're a student who has personally signed up for Fiveable, you're good. You're getting all the stuff. But if your teacher hasn't signed you up and you haven't signed up personally, then there will be, as we go into the second semester, there will be a lot of features of Fiveable that are only, available to people who have signed up. So with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I don't see any other questions coming in, and I certainly appreciate everybody who has joined us. Sorry, Jose, but better late than never. Better late than never. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will see y'all again next week. And again, our focus will be on Napoleon. And Emily, we can include the Congress of Vienna in Napoleon. So that's certainly fine if we get into the Congress of Vienna. So that, we'll go ahead and make that kind of inbounds for, because some people would address that. There's always the question of like, I tend to do the Congress of Vienna like in the next unit, but there's certainly like calls for talking about that and the new order that's established there. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all so much for joining me, and I will be back at the same time next week. So looking forward to it, and thank y'all. Somebody's got my name. Victor's got my face there as his profile picture. So Victor should get extra credit if he's part of one of these extra credit groups. It's always a pleasure.